was Martin Luther King Jr.? By Bonnie Bader. Illustrated by Elizabeth Wolfe. Chapter 7. Freedom comes to Birmingham. Martin Luther King Jr. understood that the civil rights movement would suffer defeats. But now he was more determined than ever to prove the power of peaceful protest. He looked for the city with the toughest Jim Crow laws. It was Birmingham, Alabama. If Albany, Georgia was bad, Birmingham was worse. Schools were still segregated in Birmingham. The water fountains were still marked colored or white. Birmingham's police commissioner was Bull Connor. He was very tough on black people. He made them afraid to speak out against Jim Crow laws. Even the white people who did not like segregation were afraid to say anything at all. Martin and the leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had a plan. Besides sit-ins at lunch counters, meetings were held at black churches all around Birmingham. At churches, protesters talked to people. They talked about peaceful protest. They sang freedom songs. We shall overcome, black and white together. We shall overcome someday. As Martin knew, the songs inspired a crowd. They gave black people courage for a good cause. The Birmingham protests began after 3 days of sit-ins. 35 people had been arrested. Now it was time for the second part of Martin's plan. Step 2. Martin and the leaders of the SCLC decided to boycott white businesses. Martin knew this would anger store owners. Almost half the people living in Birmingham were black. Without black customers, the stores would have a hard time making money. On April 6, Martin organized a march to the Birmingham City Hall. Many people joined this march, but Bull Connor was growing angry, like a bull. He and the policemen took clubs and beat some of the protesters. Police dogs were let loose, but the people did not run away. Instead, they became stronger. Muscles. Well, not like that, but in the feeling. Stronger, braver, awesomer. Okay, awesomer isn't a word. Silly me. After 10 days, 500 people had been sent to jail. Some were released on bail, but about 300 remained locked up. Gasp! Up until this time, Martin had not taken part in the marches. If he joined in, then he'd be arrested, and if he was in jail, he wouldn't be able to stay in charge. On April 12th, Martin and the other leaders of the protest met in Martin's hotel room. Ooh, a fancy hotel! Martin's father and brother were there too. Martin Luther King Sr. wanted his son to come home. Easter was on Sunday, and he wanted Martin back at church to preach. Some of the other leaders thought Martin could stay and lead a protest. Other leaders did not want him to march because they feared he would be arrested. And still others thought that Martin should try to raise money to bail out protesters from jail. An argument started. No, argument. Martin left the room to think and pray. When he returned, he was wearing jeans. He wore jeans whenever he went to jail. Martin had made up his mind. He would join the protesters on their next march. Just as expected, Martin was arrested. Oh, come on, again? Usually, he was able to call his wife, Coretta, right away. But this time, he was not allowed to make a call. After 2 days, Coretta, who had recently given birth to their 4th child, became frantic. Martin had been put in a jail cell all by himself. No one was allowed to visit, not even his lawyers. The cell was small and very dark. The only light came from a tiny window near the ceiling. Whoa. Martin was scared. He worried about his wife and family. He worried about other protesters. Even white ministers were against Martin. In a letter to Birmingham News, 8 white pastors said that protest was wrong. They felt the SCLC should not break laws. They said that Martin and his group were stirring up hatred and violence. In response, Martin wrote a long letter. Since he did not have any paper in jail at all, he wrote on the edges of newspapers. He even wrote on toilet paper. In this letter, Martin said that people should obey just laws, but they should disobey unjust laws. Even so, he said they should always behave peacefully and should be ready to accept punishment for disobeying the laws. Martin willingly served his time in jail. After 8 days, a week plus 1 day, he was released. Finally, Martin could see the light of day again. His eyeballs must have been burning up. Now, one of Martin's advisors had a new plan. He wanted to organize a children's march. At first, Martin was against this plan. Wasn't it too dangerous? But Martin's advisors did not think that the police would throw children in jail. Thousands of Birmingham children, from 6-year-olds to even teenagers, were trained in peaceful protest. They joined together in marches, and yes, some children were put in jail. On May 2nd, a huge demonstration was planned. Thousands of young people wanted to take part. At one black school, the principal locked up the gates to keep the students inside, but they had climbed over the gates. This march was too important to miss. They were marching for freedom! Freedom! Bull Connor and his men came to the march too. They brought clubs to beat the protesters. Police dogs ripped at the marchers' clothes. The police knocked down people with blasts of water from giant fire hoses. Actually, I think that would be like doing the ice bucket challenge. Then the home of Martin's brother was firebombed. Other bombs were set around the city. But reporters were there too, and cameramen. They wrote stories. They filmed what was going on and happening. By the 1960s, American homes had a television. Yay! Through television, people became more connected to the outside world. It is one thing to read about an attack in the newspaper. It is quite different to see it happening on TV. I watch the news almost always when my parents watch it. Martin understood the power of television. Super television! Super television. He was glad that this struggle was being brought into people's living rooms on a daily basis. Americans were outraged. Many white business leaders in Birmingham were fed up. But what upset many the most was not the violence, but all the lost business. They're greedy. They held a meeting and decided to give in on some of the march's demands. These were some of the promises. Lunch counters, restrooms, fitting rooms, and drinking fountains would be desegregated. Blacks would be able to get better jobs. The protesters in jail would be released. A committee of black people and white people would be formed to help ease tensions between the races. At last, the Jim Crow laws in Birmingham were gone. Martin had won a great victory. Chapter 8. I Have a Dream. Birmingham proved to black people all around the country what protesting could do. From North Carolina to Tennessee to Oklahoma, black Americans marched and held sit-ins. They held protests in front of government buildings. Gradually, thousands of lunch counters, hotels, schools, and parks became integrated. Then, on June 11, 1963, President Kennedy asked Congress to pass a civil rights bill. Kennedy said, "I am asking the Congress to enact legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public, hotels, restaurants and theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments. This seems to me to be an elementary right." On August 28, 1963, Martin and other black leaders led a march to Washington, D.C. They wanted to show Congress how many people supported the Civil Rights Bill. More than 250,000 Americans came from all over the United States. Many rode in cars and buses. Others flew in airplanes. Some walked, and some roller skated. Most of the marchers were black, but there were also thousands of white people. They too felt that the laws of segregation were unjust. The people marched towards the Lincoln Memorial, singing along the way. Many leaders spoke that day, but Martin was unforgettable. Martin had written a speech, but he did not read it. Once he had faced the crowd, he remembered a speech he had given a few months before. In that speech, he used the phrase, "I have a dream," over and over to express his hopes for the future. Martin wanted to use those same words again, so he put down his script and spoke. His dream was that one day the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. He had a dream that one day people would judge his 4 young children for who they were and not by the color of their skin. Martin's speech ended on a powerful note of hope. He believed that when that day came, everyone could join hands and sing the words to an old slave song. Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last! The march and Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech were carried on television stations. Whoa, television! It was the first time millions of Americans heard Martin speak. His words inspired the crowd. His words inspired the nation. His words inspired the entire world, maybe even the entire universe. Woo! Because of this speech, Martin Luther King Jr. became the voice of the civil rights movement. Woohoo! Yee-hoo! The Gettysburg Address. Almost exactly 100 years before President Kennedy's speech to Congress about the Civil Rights Bill, President Abraham Lincoln, he delivered the Gettysburg Address. It too was about civil rights. It is still one of the most famous speeches in American history. On November 19, 1863, President Lincoln, he spoke about freedom and democracy. It was during the Civil War, and he gave the speech in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where a great battle had been won by the North. He said that 87 years ago, or 87 years earlier, the nation was formed with the idea that all men were created equal. Woohoo! Equal people. That is awesome. He wanted a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Yet, 100 years after the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's dreams of equality were still not fully realized. Come on, seriously? But just 2 weeks later, on September 15th, 1963, disaster struck. A blast rocked the early morning silence in Birmingham, Alabama. A bomb went off in the 16th Street Baptist Church. A bomb, kaboom! Whoa. 4 black girls lay dead. They were Denise McNair, age 11, Carol Robertson, age 14, Cynthia Wesley, age 14, and Addie Mae Collins, age 14. People all around the country were shocked. Martin was filled with grief and bitterness. He contacted President Kennedy to say that he was going to Birmingham to make sure that there was no violent reaction by blacks to the bombing. President Kennedy sent 25 FBI agents and bomb experts to investigate. Then, on November 22, disaster struck again. President John F. Kennedy was shot dead in Dallas, Texas. He was the 4th U.S. president to be killed while in office. The Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson became president. 5 days after President Kennedy's death, President Johnson spoke to Congress. He asked them to pass the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had wanted. This was the best way to honor President Kennedy's memory. Congress agreed. On July 2nd, 1964, almost 100 years after the country saw the end of slavery, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. And standing next to President Johnson when he signed the bill was Martin Luther King Jr. Major features of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Anyone could register to vote. Literacy tests to see if voters, both black and white, could read and write could still be given. Discrimination in hotels, motels, restaurants, and other public places was outlawed. The Attorney General could take segregated schools to court. Money could be taken away from any state programs that practice discrimination. Companies with more than 15 employees could not discriminate among the workers. Chapter 9, the Peace Prize. Martin showed people of all over the world the power of words, not fists. In 1964, Martin was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. This award is given almost every year to the person or group who has done something important in the cause of world peace. Martin was very grateful for this award, but he knew it wasn't his alone. It belonged to the thousands of brave people who had taken part in the nonviolent fight for equal rights. Martin gave away all the Peace Prize money, $54,000, to civil rights groups. The Nobel Peace Prize. Alfred B. Nobel was a Swedish chemist and engineer who invented dynamite. Kaboom! When Nobel died in 1896, he left $9 million in his will to establish the Nobel Prize. The prizes are awarded almost every year in 6 categories: peace, literature, physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, and economics. Many different people, from teachers to judges to politicians, can be nominated for an award. In some years, as many as 200 nominations are received. The Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to many people and organizations since 1901. Some past winners include President Barack Obama in 2009, President Jimmy Carter in 2002, Nelson Mandela in 1993, Elie Wiesel in 1986, and Mother Teresa in 1979. Martin Luther King Jr. had won the Nobel Peace Prize, but he knew he had not reached his goal: equality for all people. He thought about the defeat in Albany and the success in Birmingham. Surely there were other cities that Martin could help end segregation. Martin's eyes turned towards Selma, Alabama. Although half of Selma's residents were black, only 1% was registered to vote. The voting office was only open for a few days a month, which made it difficult for people to register. In addition, the literacy test was so hard. When Martin said that even the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court might not know some answers. For weeks, Martin led groups to the courthouse to register to vote. But it was not legal to hold the marches in Selma, so the groups were arrested. Thousands of black people were sent to jail just because they wanted the right to vote for someone. On February 1st, 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested during one of the marches. While Martin was in jail, a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee invited a man named Malcolm X to Selma to speak. Malcolm X was a young black leader who disagreed with Martin's peaceful protests. Malcolm X did not believe in fighting with words alone. He thought it was okay to use your fists and more. Malcolm X also spoke about so-called black pride, how blacks should respect themselves and be proud of their race. While Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail, he wrote a letter that was published in the New York Times. In New York, New York. In the letter, Martin said, "There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on the voting rolls." Marches spread to many countries in Alabama. One night, a black marcher, Jimmy Lee Jackson, was shot during the voter registration drive. He was 26 years old only. Just 26 years old. Before he died, Jimmy Lee said that a state trooper had gunned him down. The black community in Selma was outraged. But Martin still did not want people to fight back with more violence. He thought Malcolm X was wrong. So Martin organized a march from Selma to Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, to demand voting rights for black people. At the time, the governor of Alabama was George Wallace. He did not want the march to take place. He put a ban on it. Did this stop Martin? No. On March 7, 650 marchers set out for Montgomery. Since this was a Sunday, Martin stayed back at his church in Atlanta to preach. He planned to take a plane to Montgomery later that day to meet up with the marchers. As usual, the protesters were marching in peace. But soon, state troopers armed with nightsticks and tear gas appeared. They attacked the group. Some state troopers on horseback trampled the marchers. About 70 people were injured. The violence was captured by television cameras. People all over the country were so angry about what had happened that they protested in their own cities. Martin, too, was horrified at the news. He also felt guilty about not being with the marchers. So he planned another march 2 days later. On March the 9th, Martin led a group of 1,500 from Selma toward Montgomery. Beforehand, Martin told people to leave the line if they had any doubts about remaining. He had to be sure that they wouldn't fight back even if they were beaten up. As they crossed a bridge, the marchers faced a wall of state troopers. Martin saw that many would be hurt, even killed. Marching was one thing, getting murdered was another. So he turned the group around. Then good news arrived. Very, very good news. President Johnson said the protesters had the right to march. He promised to send in troops to protect the marchers. Yay! Suddenly, people from all over the country wanted to join in. On March the 21st, the group set out. Protestants, Catholics, Jews, blacks, and whites all marching together. To Martin, it was a beautiful sight. People walked through quiet valleys and over steep hills. They walked along the highways, stopping only to rest for a minute or two. Their bodies ached, their feet were sore, but their hearts were light. By the time they reached Montgomery, they were 25,000 strong. At the state capitol building, they handed a petition to Governor George Wallace demanding voting rights for Black Americans. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. President Johnson said, "Every American citizen should have an equal right to vote." Yet the harsh fact that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they are Negroes. Now there would be no more literacy tests, and United States government workers would be in charge of registering voters. The Selma Freedom Marchers had won! Woohoo! They had won, they had won, they had won, they had won. Civil rights leaders who gave their lives for their cause. Medgar Evers was from Mississippi. Growing up, he always questioned the Jim Crow laws. By the time he was in college, he started local chapters of the NAACP. And after being turned down by the University of Mississippi Law School, he fought for the desegregation of the school. On June 12, 1963, Evers was killed. He was 37 years old. A white man named Byron de la Beckwith was accused of the murder. He stood trial twice in the 1960s, but the all-white juries in both cases could not decide if he was guilty or innocent. Finally, in a third trial in 1994, 31 years after Evers' death, Beckwith was found guilty. Kabam, you are guilty. He was sentenced to a life in prison. Andrew Goodman was from New York City. In 1964, Goodman and Mickey Schwerner, who was from Philadelphia, went to Mississippi to register blacks to vote. And by the way, both Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner were white. On the night of June 20, 1964, the two reached Meridian, Mississippi. There, a black man named James Chaney joined the group. The three civil rights workers were arrested for speeding and told to leave town. But members of a violent racist group called the Ku Klux Klan tracked them down and killed them. Aw, they were all young men when they died. They were all young men when they died. Goodman was 21, Schwerner was 25, and Chaney was 21 too. In 1967, 19 white men were arrested for the deaths of the three civil rights workers. 7 of the men were found guilty. 2 men, E.G. Barnett, who was running for sheriff of Meridian, and Edgar Ray Killen, a local minister, were set free because the jury could not reach a decision. It wasn't until almost 40 years later, in 2005, that Killen was also found guilty of the murders.